This is your opportunity to pose any questions you'd like concerning any of the matters that have been raised in the first half. And there are plenty of them, so I expect we'll be here till about 4 o'clock this afternoon. But unfortunately, we have to stop at 12:30, so if you want to ask a question, you better get in first, because he won't be here for that long, and there's so much there to consider. So, over to you.
Well, who's going to start the ball rolling?
Can I start? Can you say a bit more about the early years of Christianity? You mentioned Ethelbert had enabled these people to come over and preach Christianity. How much of a foothold did it get in his reign, and what was the attitude of subsequent kings?
Right. How much of a foothold did Christianity get in Ethelbert's reign, and what happened in subsequent reigns? The early part of Christianity in England. Well, briefly, because it's quite a big subject. Ethelbert's immediate successor, I think his name was Eadbald, didn't really take to Christianity, in fact, and many of the churches were pulled down, and the monks had to flee, and they had quite a difficult time of it, in fact. And in fact, Christianity only really gets a foothold when Ethelbert's daughter, Bertha by name, marries... Oh, no, not Bertha. Bertha's his wife. I'm awfully sorry. It's something like that, anyway. It's a very funny name. Ethelberga. That's exactly what my pupils do when I say it. I don't know what goes through their mind. She married Edwin, who became king of Northumbria. Edwin was in exile at the time. He spent most of his life running from kingdom to kingdom because a wicked kinsman of his called Ethelfrith, lovely name, Ethelfrith, Prince of Peace, savage man, who had usurped the throne in Northumbria, kept Edwin out. When Edwin finally became king of Northumbria, defeated Ethelfrith at the Battle of the River Idle in 616, he became king of Northumbria, and he asked Ethelberga to come and marry him. He'd met her at the court of King Ethelbert, and she was a Christian, he wasn't, but she brought with her one of the missionaries, a chap called Paulinus. He came over, in fact, in the second wave of missionaries, and he eventually, after a long, arduous process, manages to convince Edwin that Christianity is the right thing, and Edwin is converted. And the story goes on from there, because Edwin, unfortunately, is killed in a battle in 632, and all the churches in Northumbria are then pulled down. And Christianity only really gets a hold when the Celtic mission, which is busy working away in Scotland, unites with this Roman mission in Northumbria, because Edwin's successor is Oswald, who comes from the island of Iona, which is already Christian, off the coast of Scotland, established by St. Columba in about 563, I think. And you get this wonderful fusion of these two great traditions, Celtic Christianity, which came from Ireland, into Northumbria, and the Roman mission, which almost snuffs it, but gets new life from this mixture of these two traditions. I hope that goes some way to answering that question. I believe you had a question.
Yeah. How do you feel that all these matters might relate to the current crisis in the monarchy?
In the monarchy?
Yeah.
How might this relate to the current crisis in the monarchy? Well, really, basically, what the institution of kingdom is about is sovereignty and embodying within a community the sovereignty which we wish to govern us. So we give it authority. Now, history is really about how to solve the problem of having a bad monarch, actually. And we've solved the problem by pretty much denuding the monarch of any real authority. But what a monarch embodies is this principle of reason, as I've described earlier. And the way a monarch should exercise that is by this simple principle. If you govern people, you must care for their welfare totally. That's your only concern. No other. Now, the governments that we elect in this democratic world of ours don't tend to do that, by the simple virtue of the fact that they are party political. They can only satisfy various sections of the community at once. So sovereignty vested in one monarch was an ideal way of achieving that goal, providing you could ensure that the monarch, of course, behaved reasonably. Now, our history since, I suppose, the advent of kings in this country, since the dawn of time, has been all about how do you control, as it were, that sovereign authority. You've got to give it freedom. You've got to give it power. You've got to give it authority. But what happens if it goes wrong? And of course that's a great subject, and from Magna Carta in 1215 to the Bill of Rights in 1689 onwards, we've wrestled with that problem in this country. What we came up with was a mixed constitution where the monarch presided over all the institutions of government and, as it were, kept a watch and had the ultimate authority to disband the government if it should blatantly act against the interests of the people. And that's really where we stand at the moment. It's a very important authority. If the House of Commons decides not to prorogue itself, the monarch can step in and prorogue it. Now that's important. That's a defence against tyranny. It's often forgotten in this day and age. They say the monarch is just a useless accessory. We ought to tax it, get as much as we can out of it from tourism, and let it die a death. But what we don't realise is it's our only safeguard, really, against the tyranny of the House of Commons. Obviously, if the Queen or her successors did act in that way, we'd probably have a civil war. But at least it's an option. I don't know if that answers your question.
My history is very lax, but has that ever happened? Has royalty ever done that? Disbanded?
Oh yes. I mean, we forget a revolution in this country, and during the era of the Stuarts frequently ignored Parliament, yes, and treated it as just a way of exercising divine right, basically, which was not the way the English had allowed the system to evolve. The Stuarts, of course, had a different legacy from Scotland, where they dictated their views to the Parliament. That was not what had been happening in England, and the two clashed and we had a revolution. And indeed it ended with the king being executed in 1649. We had 11 years without a king, so we've tried it. We didn't like it, and we asked Charles II to become king in 1660. And we've stuck with that system pretty much ever since, the House of Commons gradually wresting to itself more and more authority, until it's got pretty much nearly all of it at the moment.
How can we change it?
Well, that's not ready for me to say. I'm not going to suddenly start advocating we have another revolution. It would be a rather strange revolution in any case, because I would advocate that we are governed by the most reasonable. Now, how do you attain that? I think the only answer is to hold philosophy groups and hope that people become inspired and seek to pursue wisdom in their lives, and in that way society benefits. It's very difficult to do it any other way, certainly not by tinkering with the institutions. Any other questions? Sorry, I'll come back to you.
During the period that you've been talking about, do you consider the church was much stronger than it is today?
Oh yes.
And if so, would we benefit as a society if the church was to get stronger?
Right. Do I consider the church was stronger in the period I've been discussing? And if so, would we benefit from having a stronger church? I think strong is probably the wrong word. It was a way of life in the early Middle Ages, and it was a repository for all the learning that society had acquired, all of it. There's a number of reasons for that. The only way you could be educated after the decline of the Roman Empire was in church schools. And they realised that to be educated you had to have the benefits of a classical learning. Ambrose was fluent in Greek, for instance, despite being brought up in Rome. So Christianity was very much more than attending church. It was really a way of life, and it infiltrated into the whole fabric of society and into people's thinking. After all, what was it? All it was saying was that God had become man, incarnated as man, and had sacrificed himself for the world, and had shown that it was possible to attain perfection. Christ said, "Be ye therefore perfect." And this was the aim of human life. That's what Christianity was teaching. So it's a very practical religion. And so people didn't treat it as something, as a part of life, something you went to, something you occasionally got involved with, like we would today. It's very much that was their life. There was no rivals, if you like. Today, well, I'm a great believer in the benefits of organised religion as it happens. I think there's a great deal to be said for that and for worshipping in public for one reason or another. After all, what does it do but attack this egoism, which is really the enemy, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to have a society when everybody is acting from their own ego, what kind of a society is that? At least organised religion tends to break that down. But whether Christianity is a vehicle for that today, I do not know. It's a very good question. I'm going to leave it open. Sorry, there's a gentleman here.
I wanted to ask, at any time before, say, Magna Carta,
before Magna Carta,
yes. What you can say of the Platonic teaching or any Christian thought and teaching that a monarch who could behave so badly that he was unfit to be a monarch at all, not just to be excommunicated until he repented. That the question arise much before Magna Carta.
Well, funnily enough, I think the answer is no. Because there were plenty of bad monarchs. I mean, Ethelred the Unready springs to mind. Glorious reign by virtue of its ingloriousness. But what's striking about his reign is that his rule was not challenged. And those that finally conquered the country, firstly Sweyn in 1013, who unfortunately dies, and then Canute, are happy to become kings in Ethelred's place. There's no concept of changing the way things are organised. Ditto William the Conqueror, who is happy to become King of England rather than extend his dukedom. So it's very powerfully entrenched, this concept of a king being divinely appointed. Augustine provides us with the philosophy that if you have a bad king, it's your own fault. And he goes back to Cicero, who says in De Re Publica, he says that basically society is a product of our sins anyway. That's the reason we're living in it. And And we've all been incarnated into this world to, as it were, expiate our sins. And society is there for that benefit. If you get a bad king, it's bad luck. You just have to put up with it. It's your own fault. Something in divine providence has decided that you will live at that particular time. And this is the way people have thought, I think. William Rufus is another baddie, and the church didn't like him either, son of William the Conqueror. But he got away with it. I mean, in a sense, someone accidentally shot him in the New Forest. I suppose that's one of the hazards of not behaving like a king should. Why someone hadn't got the guts to do that to Ethelred the Unready, we'll never know. What a shame. There you are. Perhaps he was clever at avoiding it. His brother, half-brother, Edward the Martyr, only reigned 4 years. No one liked him, not even St Dunstan, the great Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was conveniently done away with. Why on earth couldn't they do that with Ethelred? I don't know. But I don't think there was any institutional way of dealing with a bad monarch before Magna Carta, interestingly enough, which makes Magna Carta that much more significant, of course. Sorry, did I interrupt someone? Yes.
In view of the light of your studies, do you feel that the Dark Ages is a misnomer?
Yes. I do think the Dark Ages is a misnomer, absolutely. Yes. And wherever you look in the Dark Ages, I was drawn to the Dark Ages because it seemed dark. I was convinced that there was something going on there which we hadn't really had illuminated. And of course, wherever you look, there's light, and masses of it. What's interesting is that at times of considerable upheaval, these men, bishops, possibly the occasional king, abbots, are working all the time to promote the teaching, the universal philosophy of reason, of wisdom, of self-rule. And it's remarkable how successful they were. The highlights I've been demonstrating this morning are just these great churchmen preaching to the greatest of kings and actually having an effect. But so much work was going on underneath all that we know nothing of. Certainly not the Dark Ages. Sorry.
You mentioned at one point that there was this sort of tradition going from Ambrose to Augustine to Oregon, and then somehow the idea of, well, maybe I got this wrong, but the idea of Platonic kingship actually started to cross the church in some way, so they had a reaction to it. But at the same time, there was this tension of it being instilled within the church. I just wanted to know a bit more about that. How did that happen? How was that manifest in England, particularly?
Surprisingly infrequently. But what happened was the church had to establish a doctrine. It needed to do that to prevent itself becoming just an umbrella organisation, if you like. And so it began to decide what should be included in the canon, its teaching, and what shouldn't. And this takes a long time, but inevitably the teaching of Plato was viewed askance, as it were. It was considered to be pagan. Plato lived 3 centuries before Christ. You know, how could he possibly have known the truth? And there were all kinds of philosophers to incorporate him. But they were nevertheless suspicious about it. They believed that perhaps God in his providence had given these people insight, as they had with Moses. So we'll include the Old Testament, that's all right. But nevertheless, they weren't happy with the whole of the classical world. And they begin to get militant, even during the reign of Theodosius the Great. In 391, he closes all the so-called pagan temples. And from Constantine, 70 years earlier, who is saying Christianity can be part of my empire, to Theodosius, who says it's the only religion you're allowed, is an enormous leap. And it takes place very quickly. And there's, of course, a danger in that, a great danger in that. Justinian then closes the Athenian Academy in the middle of the 6th century, where Platonic teaching was still flourishing. And that's quite a landmark. And you do get a sort of Dark Ages in a way, because Plato becomes less accessible right up until the 12th century, in fact, where suddenly people are advertising their learning, even though they're often not well received. They're advertising the fact that they're Platonists. Yes?
Sorry, I know that somebody else wanted to ask a question as well. Did that reflect differently in the Celtic church? Because there was a bit where it sort of all went to Ireland for a bit, and in a sense it was seen as a repository of sort of early Christian thinking, which then developed in its own way and then sort of came back again.
Yes.
So is there a difference between the relationship to Platonism within that Irish Celtic strain and the Mediterranean strain of Catholicism, the Romans?
Yes. Of course, they both came from the same source, but the Celtic Christianity was really fostered in the monasteries of the Mediterranean, in fact, Leyran in particular. And Patrick was a monk, and he had learnt his monasticism in the Mediterranean world, which was very much more mystic, definitely, and certainly had this almost Gnostic concept that you could attain spirituality through the use of the mind, rather than a more Roman view, which is more systematic and more dependent on priests and bishops and archbishops and so on. The Romans loved order. And that Celtic strain comes into England. You get these great Celtic saints like Cuthbert, for instance, Aidan, who are extraordinary people. And their view is that they can save society by going deep within themselves. And Cuthbert spends the last 6 years of his life alone on the island of Inner Farne, fighting the demons. If any of you haven't been to the island of Inner Farne, off the coast of Northumbria, I do recommend it. Because whatever he was doing in those 6 years, I think he succeeded. I mean, the place is abundant with wildlife. It's a wildlife sanctuary. There are seals, there are otters, there are birds of every description. It's extraordinary. Now, all right, there's a leap in the imagination required there, which I don't want you necessarily to take, but the Celtic saints had this idea that you could attain spirituality in this way and then benefit the whole of society. And the Romans were much more systematic. There's a lovely story of Augustine, the one I've been talking about, who is told by Gregory to speak to the Celtic bishops who are known to exist in Wales, for instance, at this time, and bring them into the Roman Church. That's what Gregory says to Augustine, his man in England. And Augustine decides to hold a meeting. He sends out messages, and they go among the Celts, and the message gets through, and these Celtic bishops begin to arrive for a meeting somewhere near Gloucester. And it's fascinating what then takes place, because what the Celts do is they go to a hermit on the way, a wise man, and they say to him, shall we accept the authority of Augustine, coming from the Pope in Rome? We normally accept only the authority of our abbot, because he's proven spiritually, you see. Not just an automatic manifestation of a particular role. And the hermit says, when you get to Augustine, if he stands up to greet you, then accept his teaching and come under his authority. If he remains seated, don't bother. Pretty sound test. Anyway, they arrive and he remains seated. Why does he remain seated? Because in the Roman Church, a bishop sits and people come and listen to him. He has his sedes, his seat. That's what a cathedral is. We still use the word see, bishop's see. It means his seat. And the teacher in the Roman tradition sat and his pupils came. You don't stand up and greet them when you're going to put them under your authority. So, of course, they shook the dust off their sandals and went home. And the two traditions didn't meet at that stage. But it is a nice insight into the difference in the traditions. One believes in a holiness which is not automatic, and the other believed in this systematic approach. I think the two had a happy marriage in the end. Yes?
In view of your comments regarding the safeguarding of monarchy, do you feel it's significant that Prince Charles makes social comment, whereas his recent predecessors have not?
Do I think it's significant that Charles makes social comment, where his immediate predecessors have not? Well, as somebody, as we all are, interested in philosophy, I have a certain empathy for Charles. I actually believe he's a remarkable man. He seems deeply concerned about matters of great importance, and it's rather refreshing to hear him in comparison to the stale day-to-day utterance of our rather mediocre politicians. Whether he'll maintain that as a monarch and whether he should is another question, because the monarch's role is really this role of watching, of being detached, of observing, of being a repository in case of need of the absolute sovereignty of the people. And so he'll obviously, I think, have to take a less active role. What he's doing at the moment, I think, is splendid. But in relation to exercising kingship, I think probably not. But at least we'll know what he stands for. Yes?
Is not the very idea of kingship enhancing the importance of the ego in some way?
Of the ego?
Yes.
Kingship enhancing the importance of the ego. Well, certainly if you look at the history of our monarchs, it does appear that way. The problem with the ego is that it's merely individual. I mean, what else is that's what it is by definition, isn't it? Now, the monarch can't operate on the level of the individual. He has to at least operate on the level of nation, hopefully on the level of humanity, but they're rare. If he's operating on the level of ego, he can only satisfy desires, can't he? After all, there's another definition of the ego, really. And really, we as a people want more from a monarch, I think. Do you mean that he should satisfy our egos? Is that what you mean?
No,
just his own ego?
He's satisfying his own, which is a contradiction of everything that philosophy should be about.
But what I've been trying to put across this morning is that the church is very keen to impress upon the king that that was not his function, quite the opposite, and that he should exercise his rule purely as a philanthropic exercise. He would benefit, but in heaven, possibly on earth. His memory will certainly be respected after he dies, but his basic aim is to uplift his people. I'm always impressed by Alfred, who actually says, right at the end of his reign, and he's explaining what he's tried to do in his life, he actually says this, and you can't get anything more anti-ego in a way, if I can find it. He says, somewhere, oh no, it's just... In brief, I desired to live worthily as long as I lived, and to leave after my life to the men who should come after my memory in good works. I think Alfred understood that, he really did. He worked hard for the good of his people, and we benefit from it. After all, if you take Alfred's ego, at one stage, all Alfred possessed in way of a kingdom was about 100 metres by 50 metres of a little island above the marshes of Somerset called Athelney. He'd been defeated, the Danes had taken over most of his kingdom, and he'd been surprised, he hadn't been expecting them, and that was his kingdom. Had a few thanes with him. Imagine that. It's about the size of a football pitch. And if you go there and stand there today, the marshes have drained, and what's very clear is that a decision was made there which has affected all of us. And that decision was exactly the opposite of what you'd expect the ego to take. Because he could easily have taken a boat. You can see the River Parrett when you stand on the Isle of Athelney, which is tidal. It links to the Severn Estuary. He could have taken a boat. He had friends abroad. Indeed, the King of Mercia, a chap called Burgrade, had done precisely that. He was living a princely life in the courts of Europe. Why bother staying and fighting when you've only got a few men? And the Danes have taken over most of the kingdom. Now, the decision he took, which was to do precisely that, to fight for his kingdom, is a decision which is from which the entire English-speaking world has sprung. We'd be speaking Danish if he hadn't. And he's no Shakespeare, you know. I mean, it doesn't sound to me like a decision of the ego. Anyway, I'll leave that with you. Yes?
It's not my intention with my question to sound politically correct, but it's just curiosity. Where are women, or as an historian, what
women.
is it, yes, in all this?
Yes, very good question. Because most of their work is unseen, of course. Take the Anglo-Saxon period. The problem with the king was he kept getting killed. Now that is one of the hazards of the job. I mean, in Anglo-Saxon England, your role basically was to lead the troops. The first king who doesn't do that is Edgar, and the only reason he doesn't do that is because he doesn't need to. Edgar the Peaceable. But it doesn't half lead to trouble. And Ethelred the Unready, you don't see him leading troops. Who's leading troops in Ethelred's reign? Britnoff, Earl of Essex, who gets killed doing it. No, you've got to lead troops, which means that basically your life is at risk. And the kings tended to have short lives. And there, the continuity, of course, falls upon their wives, the queens. And if you look at what they're up to in Anglo-Saxon England, it is remarkable. They're establishing abbeys for women, like Hild in Whitby, Ely, established by Egfrith's wife, who runs away from him, actually. Coldingham. They're great, and people came from all over Europe to hear these women. They were saints. And they provide this continuity. They provide schools, which it was customary for the royal women to attend. And so they're doing a great deal of work which is all unseen. But, of course, it's fundamental to continuity. They marry across the frontiers, as it were. If you're the king of Northumbria, you want your daughter to marry a prince. Well, she can't marry your own sons because that's incest. She has to marry the sons of another prince. And that creates an immediate diplomatic tie, which is crucial. But throughout history, they've played this role. If you look at the role of Margaret, having married Malcolm, King of Scotland, she was one of the last great Anglo-Saxons, Margaret, granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, one of my great heroes, only reigned from April to November. But glorious months. She single-handedly civilises Scotland, with my apologies to any Scots who may be here. Quite a remarkable woman, and they're not uncommon. But their history is it's worth investigating, and it's a long and painstaking job. Most of it is unseen. The monks write the history, and they're writing about kings.
Ethelberga, who you mentioned earlier, she's not the one who's got the church over in Ely Place, is she?
She may well be.
Ethelberga over there.
May well.
Church.
May well.
It's because it's got relations with Ely.
Oh, really? No, that may be. You're not thinking of Etheldrada. Yes, I think you probably are. Etheldrada, she was called Ethelthryth in Anglo-Saxon. They always changed the thus to does when they Latinised it. Yes, she was Egfrith's wife, and she got enamoured. Well, that's the wrong word. She became inspired by Saint Wilfrid, and Egfrith got rather frustrated by this in more ways than one, because she decided she wasn't very keen on being his queen after a while and raising children. She was much more interested in the religious life, and so he finally decides to bring her to the marriage bed, and she runs off, and there's this great chase across Northumbria, and she manages to escape, and she goes to Ely, and she's got round her neck pearls which she's worn as Queen of Northumbria, and she rips them off and replaces them with just a piece of silk, I think it is, to remind her of the riches and wealth that she has deliberately renounced. And those are known as St. Audrey's beads. Etheldrada became known as a nickname, St. Audrey, and we get the word tawdry from the fact that she wore this simple necklace. She had other problems, though. She had some physical problem, some weft under her chin or something, and they tried to remove it with a bit of elementary surgery, and she died 3 days later. But so that's Etheldrada. Apropos of nothing, but I just yes. Sorry, what should we say? One more.
Yeah, one more question. Was there any influence from the East at all? Why I ask that is shortly after the last war, I was fortunate to be Iona, the group minister who eventually became chief of the Church of Scotland. And one thing he showed us was a design on a piece of wall or a piece of stone that didn't mean anything, he said, to anybody, until one day they had a group of visitors from the Indian continent who were extremely excited by this. But I've never heard it anymore.
Yes, well, the Eastern connection. I mean, you're going back to the very roots of history here, but certainly the Celtic monasteries and the Celtic abbots were in touch with a tradition that went back to the East. Monasticism began in the deserts of Egypt and Syria. St. Anthony visited India, we know that for a fact, and the rules that these monks were using, like the rules of John Cassian, for instance, were formulated among these desert fathers. It's interesting, I've been talking about self-rule and the Platonic concept of know thyself. In the laws of Manu, which date way, way back into the mists of time, in Indian history, I just happen to have in front of me this quotation. This springs to mind. Day and night the king must strenuously exert himself to conquer his senses, for he alone who has conquered his own senses can keep his subjects in obedience. Exactly the same concept of self-rule. So that's a very big question, and thank you for raising it. Perhaps we should stop there.
Yes, I think that's a very Abbasite moment. I'd just like to thank David for an absolutely inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
I'm sure you all agree.